Yeah, that's
You're listening to Worksights, insights about the American workplace, workplace law, and the future of work. This podcast is produced by The Noble Law, an employment law firm with offices across the United States, and is hosted by managing partner Laura Noble, a recognized leader in employment law with over 20 years of diverse legal experience. This podcast is not intended to be used as legal advice and does not establish an attorney-client relationship with its listeners.
I'm so excited to have Emily Martin here today to discuss this important topic, one that's near and dear to my heart. I want to talk about the sexual harassment investigation of Governor Cuomo and his subsequent resignation. Today, we are joined by Emily Martin, who is Vice President for Education and Workplace Justice at the National Women's Law Center. Emily oversees the operation of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, a more than $22 million fund dedicated to enabling individuals challenging workplace sexual harassment and related retaliation to obtain legal representation and storytelling assistance. Emily, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So, as you probably know, Emily, in December of 2020, multiple women came forward with allegations that Governor Cuomo sexually harassed them. The executive chamber made a referral to the New York State Attorney General's office to investigate the allegations. The investigation began in March of 2021. We know the investigators interviewed about 179 people and reviewed more than 74,000 documents. And then after 5 months, the investigation ended. The report that came out had some major findings that were pretty overwhelming for the governor and his team. The report found that Governor Cuomo sexually harassed multiple women, including former and current state employees, by engaging in unwanted groping, kissing, and hugging, and making inappropriate comments. The report also found that the governor and his senior staff retaliated against at least one former employee who came forward with her story. The report found that the executive chamber fostered a toxic workplace that enabled harassment to occur and created a hostile work environment. The report concluded that Governor Cuomo's actions and those of the executive chamber violated multiple state and federal laws, as well as the executive chamber's own written policies.
Well, one of the things that I think is really important about what happened here is that it's maybe the only time where we have had this sort of set of allegations against a high-profile public official. And then there was a thorough, transparent, investigatory process that followed, and a set of conclusions that were shared with the public, with the voters, and a consequence that followed. All of those pieces sound sort of basic, elementary, but it's actually really rare that in these situations with allegations, especially against elected officials, that we have all of those steps. And I think it's really gratifying to see in action, what does it look like when you take allegations seriously, when you take harassment seriously, when you bring a serious process to bear, and when you share the findings with the public, which when you're talking about elected officials is so important. It's reassuring to see that that can work and that changes things. And I think that's really, that we're really seeing the fruit of the mobilization of women, of the Me Too movement over the years, that we could have that sort of process and that sort of result.
I appreciate that perspective because I do think that a lot of the takeaway right now is very critical of the process. And I want to get into that with you. But it is worthwhile, I think, for us to note, hey, we have made progress here, right? Like, this used to be something that was completely in the shadows, that was entirely part of the whisper campaign. I mean, obviously, you look at the Weinstein information that was an open secret in Hollywood for so many years, right? So I think that it is important that we take a moment to acknowledge that we've had made progress. And yet there are so many people who feel bitterly disappointed by what has happened here, right? That this particular political persona had been publicly very supportive of the Me Too movement and sexual harassment victims. I believe he even worked on strengthening some legislation in New York. And yet this was allowed to continue. This was going on for years. So why didn't the public know about this misconduct earlier?
Well, I think there are probably multiple reasons. I think from all accounts that one reason is reasonable fear. I mean, one of the things that the report sets out, and that I think is to some degree was common knowledge before the report, not in the context of sexual harassment, but just in terms of the atmosphere of the workplace that Governor Cuomo headed up, there was a lot of reasonable fear of retaliation. That was sort of his modus operandi, that people knew that if you went against the governor, that his people would come after you. So that means a lot if you're trying to make your way in New York politics. I also think that, prior to Me Too going viral, prior to 2017, it's not clear that if people had come forward, they would have been taken seriously. I think there really has been, not a perfect shift. It's not as though we fixed it, but there really has been a shift in our culture's willingness to hear these stories and to take them seriously. And so I think that's part of it too. And, I think also that probably one part of it is, especially when you're working in politics, when you care about, your party winning, when you care about the policies that the person you work for is putting forward, that's another reason why I think some people feel very conflicted about coming forward, because they're worried about the impact on issues way beyond Andrew Cuomo, and they worry about the harm that it could indirectly do in the world. And I'm sure that all of those pieces were reasons why it took a long time for women to feel comfortable saying this happened to me and it was wrong.
And that is consistent with my experience advising women who work in, nonprofits or an academic setting, right, where they really believe in the mission of the work that they're doing and are fearful that by coming forward, then the person who's leading that effort is going to disappear from the workplace, and then all of those efforts are going to be for naught. So there is a balancing that has to take place, but it's so frustrating to me that, as you said, it wasn't just Governor Cuomo who was enabling retaliation to happen. It was his entire team. So even as we are well past, the dawn of the Me Too movement, we still have people who are actively supporting someone who's breaking the law, who's creating a hostile, toxic workplace environment for women. And we both know how much emotional damage these victims have to go through by experiencing that. So how do we break that cycle?
I think another thing that I take from what we know about Governor Cuomo and about the workplace that he led and that his staff enabled is it really does demonstrate how having a workplace that is toxic generally is, among other things, a risk factor for sexual harassment. That once you create a norm that the folks at the top can be abusive and it's their whims that matter and it's up to everybody else to cater to those whims. Once you enable those sorts of petty and less petty abuses of power, it isn't surprising that one of the ways that those abuses of power show up is as sexual harassment. So I think that one of the lessons of all of this is to take culture of the workplace seriously, to take, the importance of treating folks who work with you and for you with respect and bringing integrity to how you deal with people in the workplace. That's important for lots of reasons. One of the reasons it's important is it makes sexual harassment and other sorts of unlawful harassment less likely to happen.
I agree so much, Emily. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about, leadership in the workplace and the differences between a typical male energy. I don't want to just say male in the gendered. I'm talking about a male energy form of leadership and a female energy form of leadership. Traditionally, the male energy form being very top-down, authoritarian, I say jump, you say how high, don't question the big guy, don't question the boss, conform, versus a female energy-led organization, which is about relationships, collaboration, transparency, everybody having a seat at the table, all voices being heard. And it's how we have structured our law firm, which is unusual for law firms because it's so traditionally, male-oriented dynamic. But I agree wholeheartedly that when you have a dynamic where people at the top can do whatever they want and there's no accountability, then yes, that sort of opens the gates for then other types of discrimination, harassment, and certainly sexual harassment, which we know is about power far more than it is about, sexual desire. So I think you're absolutely right that the power dynamic needs to be shifted and addressed in a modern workplace. Now, I wanted to talk to you about Cuomo's resignation. Not well handled, pretty clumsy, awkward, and cringeworthy to watch. Why do you think he didn't immediately resign when the report came out? I mean, the report was 300 pages or something, 179 people interviewed, 74,000 documents. It was overwhelming and horrible to read. How could you read that, which was so very credible and which, confirmed all of the allegations that were made and not immediately resign?
Well, it's a good question. And, I think that no doubt his particular personality is part of why it was hard for him to see that. And it took a little while to sink in that this was really serious and there was no getting away from it. Unfortunately, I suspect that another reason why he gave it a shot to just sort of try to brazen it out is because there have been a lot of examples of that working in the past few years. Brett Kavanaugh sits on the Supreme Court. And I could make the list longer, but it'd be too depressing. But, Donald Trump was president.
Right.
There are plenty of examples where in recent years, terrible things have come out, credible accusations, evidence of real harm, and where the elected official or the person in power just said, well, what are you going to do about it? And I think that he might have hoped that that would work for him, too.
Right. In terms of the investigation, is your sense that it was done in a completely transparent way? Do you have any thoughts on how the investigation itself was conducted and if it could have gone down in a better way?
Well, I think that certainly during the investigation, the day-to-day process wasn't completely transparent, but I think that that's probably good. I think it's hard to do an investigation that is literally transparent where, at the end of the day, you're saying, so here's what we found, here's what we found. I think that probably isn't a workable thing. What I do appreciate about how the investigation was done was the transparency first about who was being brought in to lead it and why, and the thought process for determining who would be the leads, and the thought process about bringing in outside people for this purpose and bringing them from slightly different backgrounds. I think all of that was really admirable and something to think about how to replicate in future situations. And I think the length and the detail of the report is also really a great model for what we should do in similar situations in the future, where it wasn't just bare conclusions and a press conference where there was, a lot of detail about why the Attorney General found what she found. And all of that, I think, is a really helpful response to a question that I know that I've struggled with, that a lot of people have struggled with, about how do you create a process when none of the processes that sort of exist seem to meet the situation? So I'm sure nothing is perfect, but I think this was actually a really good example of creating a process to meet a situation where there was no process in place to hold it.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think of all the things that I can criticize in this whole sad episode, I don't think the way the investigation was conducted merits much criticism. You're right. There's some things that I would have done differently that were not perfect, but It was comprehensive. It was very rooted in evidence documents. There were efforts made to determine credibility of both the witnesses and of Governor Cuomo, who, quite frankly, did not come off as being very credible.
Yeah.
And they were transparent in their findings. So, look, as a plaintiff's employment attorney, I wish that more investigations ended up this way and had this kind of report and documentation. There did seem to be a little bit of pushback from some of the celebrity fans that Governor Cuomo had at that time, right? So particularly when he was in the midst of his COVID fandom, you had folks that sort of gave a knee-jerk response of, why are you asking these questions about this great leader? We need him right now. Just leave him alone. Did you sense any of that pushback when you were following this?
I think no matter what, when there's an investigation, an elected official or a high-profile person, but especially with an elected official where there's going to be, partisans who want to protect their guy, want to protect their person, that is part of the dynamic. I think that whenever you're talking about a government official, there will be somebody or some people who come forward and say, this must be politically motivated. We can't take these allegations seriously because, look, there are people who disagree with him in politics. So I think it's just sort of baked into what this looks like when you're talking about a high-profile government official, unfortunately.
So I want to read this quote to you that Governor Cuomo said when he finally got to his resignation. He said, "I'm a fighter, and my instinct is to fight through this controversy because I truly believe it is politically motivated. I believe it is unfair and it is untruthful, and I believe it demonizes behavior that is unsustainable for society." Now, as we were talking about, this is not the first powerful man who's cast himself as a victim when faced with serious misconduct allegations. But, there are some people who say the loss of this career, the loss of this leader is too high a price to pay, that it shouldn't be a career death sentence. What do you say to that kind of response?
First, I just simply disagree that there isn't other talented political leadership that we can turn to when political leaders violate our trust in this way. It isn't that there is such a shortage of leadership in the nation that we have to accept abuses by the people in charge just because we need them to be able to continue to muddle through. I also think that there's a difference between not being governor anymore and a professional death sentence. I'm confident that if Andrew Cuomo wants to, there's other work that he will be able to do in his life. He has not been put into prison. He has not actually been expelled from society. He has been told he hasn't even been told. He's decided that he can't be governor anymore. And most of us aren't, that's okay.
Right. It always mystifies me when I see politicians, senators, congresspeople twist themselves into knots, saying things that seemingly contradict their most core principled values. And I think, is being a senator like that important in your life? You've got absolutely nothing else in your life. You have to be a U.S. senator or you will die. How about you be authentic and truthful to your values and also not be a U.S. senator and just be a private citizen like 99% of the rest of us? Maybe that's an option.
Yeah, that is a way of living that many of us are able to survive doing.
But there is this real, backlash to the backlash, right? Where the idea that men in particular in the workplace are not getting due process, right? So in one New York Times op-ed, a writer, Daphne Merkin, said she didn't believe that, quote, the scattershot, life-destroying denunciations are the way to upend it, meaning sexual harassment. In our current climate, to be accused is to be convicted. Due process is nowhere to be found. And this is an argument that I've heard from folks in my daily practice, right? Where we're doing focus groups for juries, and they're has been from both men and women, this notion that it's gone, quote unquote, too far, and that all you have to do is accuse, and the person who's being accused is decimated. There's no opportunity for them to repair the damage done to their reputation, and there's no opportunity for them to defend against the allegations.
Well, I think that Andrew Cuomo is a strange poster child for that argument, since the one thing that he got was process. This is an example of what process looks like. And as I said, I think that one of the things that was really valuable here was the creation of a process that met the moment, rather than just relying on press accounts and trying to put pressure based on press accounts, which can be really important, but which does seem like not the way we as a society should handle these questions. Is just see whether reporters can figure it out or not, and then whether the person who is being reported on feels ashamed or not. I do think that there is this misperception that it's somehow easy to say that you were sexually harassed, and that as soon as you say that, everybody listens and great men are toppled. I think that one of the things that has been and remains really clear to those of us who do this work is that coming forward with allegations of sexual harassment almost always comes with some cost. I mean, if you're still working for your employer where you were harassed, it is extremely common to be retaliated against when you make a complaint of harassment. Even if it's not formal legal retaliation, there are consequences that people reasonably fear and experience in terms of how they are treated in their careers, in their personal life, etc. That it isn't as though when you say I was sexually harassed that, people bake you a cake and there's a parade in your honor. And there are a lot of examples of that. Christine Blasey Ford went into hiding because of the threats against her, because she came out and shared her experiences. And so I think that part of the problem here is a failure to grapple with the experiences that individuals actually have when they say that they were harassed, and how that experience is difficult. And it suggests that people who do it are typically doing it for good reasons. And then I think that there's also this notion, I mean, it's sort of similar to the idea of not being governor as a death sentence, this idea that any consequence is unacceptable, that people talk about sympathy, this sort of cultural need to sympathize with the powerful man, and the idea that because he lost his job or because he lost his TV show and he's still rich, but he's no longer as honored and respected, that somehow that's a consequence which is too terrible to bear as a society. And I disagree with that.
Right. And I hope we can move as a society to that notion. But we see it all the time, even in private practice where we're dealing with perpetrators who are not as well known as a Governor Cuomo or, a Hollywood studio exec. They're still powerful within their companies and local communities. And the backlash can not be limited to just you as the accuser being fired, but your reputation being absolutely attacked and disintegrated, right? There's both from the people who are defending that actor, but also from people who don't understand how sexual harassment works in the workplace and who blame the victim, right? Well, what did she do? She must have been, letting him on or, flirting with him in some way. She brings
drama and trouble.
Yeah, right? Because that would never happen to me. I would, and you also get this idea of I have to distinguish myself from the victim because it's too scary to think about that this could happen to anyone. So, if that happened to me, I would smack him in the face and walk away. And that's great to imagine ourselves as superheroes in the workplace. But for most people, when it happens to you, the reaction is shock And you may freeze. You may not be able to process it. You may be terrified. Most folks don't respond to a powerful person who has control of their financial and career future by saying, piss off and, running out the door. It doesn't usually happen that way.
Yeah. And especially if, you are in a lower paid job, you don't have a big financial cushion. Losing this job is really the difference between your family possibly being homeless or not. I mean, there are many, many reasons why it is very hard to come forward.
So, in the context of these kinds of notions that still exist among the American workforce, I want to read to you one of the things that Cuomo said when he resigned that I found most disturbing, that really incensed me. So during his resignation, he said, quote, "In my mind, I have never crossed the line with anyone, but I didn't realize the extent to which the line has been redrawn," end quote, implying that this type of behavior that he engaged in, groping, kissing, fondling, inappropriate comments, that this type of behavior in a different era were acceptable. And he was just not up to speed on how this type of behavior is no longer considered acceptable in the workplace. Do you think this defense resonates still with the American workforce?
Well, I'm sure there are other people in the country who heard that and said, yeah, maybe they missed the part of the report that said he grabbed his assistant's breast, which, I don't think that's a recent rule in the workplace that we don't do that. But, I think it has always been the case that sort of groping, that those sorts of comments, that those sorts of leers has always made the mostly women who are the objects of that intensely uncomfortable. And what has maybe shifted is our willingness to take that discomfort seriously. It isn't that the experience of that kind of behavior in the workplace has changed and everybody used to just think it was good fun and now everyone has lost their sense of humor. It's that we have made some progress in recognizing and taking seriously the ways that sort of sexual touching, innuendo, bringing sex into the power relation in the room, we have come to take more seriously the ways in which that is really harmful to the people who are experiencing it. And that harm isn't new. It's just our greater recognition of that harm and taking that harm seriously, which I think we are making progress, and that is a good thing.
When I heard what he said, I wanted to remind him of the old adage about, everything we need to know we learned in kindergarten. Remember when we would stand in line and the teachers would say, "Keep your hands to yourself." It's not new, Governor Cuomo. Keep your hands to yourself.
It does ring a bell.
But, it's frustrating because these efforts that we have engaged in that seem to be universal now, right, that were happening in the executive chamber, which were workplace harassment trainings and, video participation, and he even sponsored legislation. And yet somehow he didn't get the memo that the line, quote unquote, had been redrawn. Like, what do we have to do to get it across to people that you cannot do this to people in the workplace?
No, this is an especially frustrating, to say the least, instance, given that he was the Attorney General. He led the Civil Rights Division. He signed a law strengthening sexual harassment protections. It's not like no one had clued him in on what the rules were, and he just was groping along, not quite understanding what the law and the standards were.
It's groping along. I love that.
Speak. It's that he felt he didn't have to worry about it, that it wasn't his job to have to take that seriously, and that he was above it. I think it's, for him in particular, given that he was a leader on this issue, given that he's an attorney, it's clearly not ignorance. It was feeling that it didn't matter for him.
Right. And he was clearly being supported and enabled by those around him.
Oh, yeah.
And who also felt that even though their, executive member was violating the law, somehow that was okay. And I would love to sort of, I don't know, get down into this psychological disconnect that you would have to go to work every day, pretending that you're, working for the good guys when he's hurting people in his workplace. It sounds like almost on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think it's my best guess as an outsider is sort of a great man theory that, he's doing such important things and we need to be united to enable him to do important things. As a powerful person, he's not held to the same standards as the rest of us. And that's okay because he's a powerful person who is doing such important stuff. I think people can talk themselves into a lot of things that way.
So I want to talk to you about that with respect to the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. Some of the criticism that has come up with respect to this organization is that the chair, Roberta Kaplan, was having backdoor dealings with Cuomo's office during the time of the investigation. And many folks were extremely disheartened by that, given that the whole purpose of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is to have a powerful advocate for women in the workplace who are essentially powerless, right? And to address that dynamic of, yes, he's a big and powerful man and many people think he's doing great things, but we've got your back and we're going to support you. And they felt unsupported and betrayed by the allegations with respect to Ms. Kaplan.
Yeah, and I can see why. So a few things as background, which I think is important. Robbie Kaplan was the chair of Time's Up, which is a C3 organization that works on issues related to harassment and women's workplace advancement. The Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is part of the National Women's Law Center, where I work, a separate organization, separate leadership. The Time's Up Legal Defense Fund provides financial support to cases challenging sexual harassment, storytelling support for individuals who are speaking out about sexual harassment. We connect people to attorneys when they're experiencing harassment at work. And so I learned about, and all of us, the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, learned about Robbie Kaplan's involvement with Andrew Cuomo's response to these allegations when we read it in the paper. And I think that what that has led us at the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund to do is to redouble our efforts to ensure that there is neither conflict nor any appearance of conflict in the work that we do, precisely because what we understand our call to be is to be a survivor-centered effort that really is about enabling individuals to challenge harassment, even when they're being harassed by somebody who is really powerful and important and has a lot of people on their side. So we're looking at our processes to make sure that they are as supportive and responsive to survivors as possible. We are winding down our work with SKDK, a public relations firm that had worked with Time's Up Legal Defense Fund with some of the storytelling assistance, just because of the sort of lack of clarity about who speaks for the fund and to avoid any appearance of conflict since SKDK has other clients. So we're bringing those public relations functions in-house. And we are taking really seriously the need to demonstrate what has been and continues to be first and foremost, our commitment to survivors. That's where we are right now.
Right. And in full transparency, I think it's important to disclose that the Noble Law has been a recipient of funds from the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund for our efforts to prosecute claims on behalf of sexual harassment victims. But we've participated in the process, which is an application process and determination by I assume, a group of folks to make the decision about whether or not it's a litigation that the fund wants to support. And we've had great experiences. No hesitation in me saying that. But, what else would you want to say to a public that has concerns about, the fund's transparency and the fund's ethical support for its victims, even if the accuser is an ally or a large donor to the fund?
It has been the case, it continues to be the case, that donating to the fund, the National Women's Law Center, is completely irrelevant as to whether we're going to support a matter against that donor. There have been situations where we have funded cases against entities that had in the past donated to the Times Up Legal Defense Fund. We disclose that to the attorney and the attorney's client in that situation so that they know that we have received funding. So there's no, sense that this is happening behind their back. It does not impact our decision making in any way. I will also say that Time's Up, the separate entity, has no control over the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund decision making as far as what to support, how much money to use to support a case. Time's Up is totally separate from any of that decision making about what we support and how. In the situations which have occasionally come up where one of the folks who do make those decisions, National Women's Law Center staff, have some sort of relationship with one of the parties in a matter that has sought support, that person doesn't participate in any decision making about support for the matter of the case. They are walled off. And the other thing I will say is that we also are really open to thoughts about how to continue to do our work in ways that build trust. This is a kind of first of its kind operation, the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. It was created in the very beginning of 2018. And, whenever you're doing a thing that's brand new, there are definitely ways to learn how to continue to improve how you do your work. And we want to hear people's thoughts if they feel like they have good ideas about how we could improve how we do our work in ways that continue to build trust.
Do you have members of the community on your board or folks who are decision making, or are they all staff of the Women's Law Center?
The decision makers about supporting individual cases are staff of the National Women's Law Center. We are thinking about, are there ways to formally have advisors from the broader community? What would that look like? How would they engage? I think it's a place where we're interested in creative thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I was headed, right? Is that, one way to build trust in the community is to have the community participate and to look under the hood and see what your process is. Mm-hmm. And, it's one thing to say, we're not going to be affected by people who are donating to us. And it's another thing to, have real evidence that is the case and support from the community and organizations that, hey, these people mean it. They will go after anyone. They don't care, which is, the fun part of my job because I don't care who you are or how much money you make or how powerful you are. But, I'm not a national nonprofit. I'm a plaintiff's employment firm. So, have you seen donations decrease as a result of this issue?
No, we have not. We have heard some questions from folks about what's happening. Can you explain? We've tried to explain and are continuing to set out sort of how we do our work, how Time's Up is a separate entity who we've worked with in various ways, but isn't the decision maker for the fund. And we hope that people will not only listen to the attempts to say, well, Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, it's too all mixed up in Time's Up that it's all very suspicious, but we'll also look at the work that we've been able to do in the world over the last 3 years, which I'm really proud of. And it's been work on behalf, not of Hollywood celebrities, which is a misconception that some people have about what the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is, but on behalf of domestic workers and women who work in car washes and restaurants and casinos. And I'm really proud of the fact that our support has enabled people who might not have been able to find an attorney to take their case to actually get some measure of justice from a legal system that is hard to navigate and isn't necessarily built to provide that justice. And I think that's good work. And I hope that people want to keep supporting it and hearing about it.
I agree wholeheartedly with that. I think that there is a misconception in the public that women who come forward with sexual harassment claims simply make an allegation and the company writes them a big check and they retire on their yacht. And, nothing is further from the truth. One, we're dealing with an antiquated law, Title VII, that has not been seriously revised for the 21st century. Mm-hmm. It has damage cap limitations. It has onerous administrative requirements, the kind of requirements that don't apply to other torts. Like if you breach a contract, you don't have to go to an administrative agency in the federal government first. You can just go straight to court. Not so if you've been sexually harassed. And the measure of damages for most defendants starts with, well, how much money was the person earning? Mm-hmm. And so if you are a low income worker, it's very difficult to get an attorney who's going to have to take the case on contingency because you as a low income worker can't afford their fee to justify doing that when at the end of the day, the defendant's only going to pay, the $10 an hour that you were making. And the law that's in place doesn't provide for it's not strongly written enough so that attorneys' fees are guaranteed if you win. And so your organization has filled a huge gap in a huge loophole in justice system where low-income people who have been sexually harassed and have strong evidence of that oftentimes cannot find a lawyer to take their case.
Yeah, that's exactly what we are setting out to do, and which I've been really gratified that at least sometimes we have been successful in doing, and sort of moving the needle as to what constitutes a case that's worth taking. And too often that determination isn't made based on how bad was the harassment, how harmful was it to the individual who experienced it, but what is the likely recovery, which really may not match up well with the actual impact.
And as a private attorney, I have heard so many things that still make my skin crawl, right? Defenses like, well, do you know what she was wearing to the interview? Defenses like, well, she worked in a nonprofit. She knew what she was getting into. We're not well organized. Just things that, and the law as written, again, requires the individual to prove both that they were personally offended by the behavior, but also that it's objectively offensive. Mm-hmm. And so who gets to decide what's objectively offensive? It goes up to the federal district courts, and they're mostly older white men who haven't worked in a workplace for much of the time, having been appointed to the federal bench for a lifetime appointment. And so you look at you know this, but you look at the old cases in the 80s, and federal judges were routinely determining that a woman who was getting slapped on the rear or, groped by her boss, that alone was not sufficiently objectively offensive to be supported under sexual harassment claims. Now, I think we have moved away from that, but those were, that was how the law was being interpreted. Which leads me to my final question for you, because I could answer this question and go on for hours, but I'm going to put it to you. If you could wave a magic wand and get whatever law in place or remedy in place for sexual harassment victims, what would it be?
Well, we've tried to answer that question by working on a bill that is in Congress called the Be Heard in the Workplace Act, which really seeks to update workplace harassment law to modernize Title VII. And it does a lot of things. One of the things it does is says that everyone who works should be protected against harassment and discrimination. So even if you work for a small employer with fewer than 15 employees, because federal law doesn't cover you in that instance, and many state laws don't either, even if you're an independent contractor rather than employee, that you shouldn't have to be sexually harassed in order to earn a living. So that's one important thing it would do. Another important thing it would do is basically try to correct the standard that you have to prove in court to prove sexual harassment. So to get away from those cases that say, well, your boss grabbed your butt, but it was just once or twice. And really, is that bad? To make clearer that that one instance can be enough, that there are a lot of factors that determine how harassment impacts somebody, including power differentials, including whether they're experiencing this in isolation, whether it's an implicit threat, and to try to reset the standards to better reflect our modern expectations in the workplace. It would lengthen the statute of limitations, which in some states is as short as 180 days that you have to bring an EEOC charge, or you can't challenge harassment at all. It would also strengthen the remedies that were available, which right now are capped at levels that were set in 1991 and haven't shifted since. 1991 was a long time ago now. And it would also provide new funding for a lot of services sort of similar to Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, a lot of new supports for individuals who needed legal help to challenge harassment or needed other sorts of services because of the harassment they experienced, because that's also a really important piece. You know, the law is important and it's never going to be a full solution. So thinking about legal remedies, what can happen if you go to court, as part of what are the set of supports and responses that we should be providing to people who experience sexual assault and other forms of sexual harassment on the job. I think that's important too, and that's one of the things that this bill would do.
So that's I'm just going to repeat it for folks who are listening, the Be Heard in the Workplace Act, and it's at the federal level.
That's correct.
We're working on what are how's it looking in terms of promise to get passed?
Well, you know, Congress it's a tough place to pass civil rights laws. But I do think that we will see some action in terms of hearings on it this year, which is the first important step. And I think that it's also already been important in providing a model for states, and that we've seen some states take up pieces of that. And so that's another way where even if Congress isn't passing it, you know, this month, that it can still be a lever for positive change in other parts of the country.
And I would do any amount of begging, pleading, persuading of our state representatives to take a look at it, because North Carolina is at the bottom of the pile in terms of states that provide protection for sexual harassment in the workplace. So I think many people don't realize that North Carolina doesn't have an anti-sexual harassment law. So if you're sexually harassed in North Carolina by a North Carolina employer, and your employer has less than 15 employees, there's literally no remedy, because there's no state law, and then there's no federal law because Title VII isn't available to you. If you are sexually harassed but not fired, there's no remedy under North Carolina state law. It's literally not prohibited by North Carolina law. If you complain about sexual harassment and are fired in retaliation for that, we don't have an anti-retaliation law. So there's no remedy for North Carolina employees at the state level.
No, it's shocking how shocking it is. Like, if you went I'm sure, to the average person on the street in North Carolina and said, you know, if your employer only has 10 employees, sexual harassment, A-OK under the law, they wouldn't believe you, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Go forth. And what did you say?
Grope
always
along.
Groping or groping along. Yeah. So your employer could be groping along, and you've got almost no remedy. We get creative and we try to work with other laws that are available to us, but it is appalling to me that in 2021 we do not have these laws in place in North Carolina. So I hope, you know, from your lips to our representatives' ears, we will do something along the lines of the Be Heard in the Workplace Act that would be helpful to folks to protect them in the workplace.
The National Women's Law Center would love to be helpful in all of the fights, including in the North Carolina State Legislature. So call on us and we will do whatever we can.
And right back at you. If you want someone to go and spew at a congressional hearing, I'm happy to do it.
I appreciate it because I've heard in this podcast that you can make the case very eloquently.
Well, Emily, I think you and I could probably spend the rest of the afternoon discussing these issues. I know we have chatted before this, but this was particularly enlightening and helpful, and I hope it will impact our listeners and in a positive way, and we can see some changes so that you and I don't have to keep discussing this over and over again.
Well, thank you for having me. And if we're discussing it, I hope we're discussing good things next time.
Great. Thanks again for joining us.
This has been Worksights. You can learn more about Laura Noble and the Noble Law on LinkedIn, Facebook, or thenoblelaw.com. Thank you for listening.